In the summer of 2018, a final report circulated through the offices of Air Force Acquisition Leadership at the Pentagon. The document summarized findings from a series of live-fire evaluations conducted at Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico, and White Sands Missile Range, tests that had run across two phases, beginning in mid-2017. The aircraft evaluated were not fifth-generation stealth platforms, or even fourth-generation multi-role fighters. They were turboprops. One of them was a modified version of the T-6 Texan II, the same airframe that every Air Force and Navy pilot in the United States had flown during primary training. The report's core finding was straightforward, and for an institution that had spent 2 decades procuring aircraft costing $80 million to $100 million per copy, deeply uncomfortable. A turboprop carrying precision-guided munitions could execute close air support and armed overwatch missions in permissive environments at roughly 1/20th of the cost per flight hour of an F-16 and 1/30th that of an F-35. The numbers were not projections. They came from actual sorties and actual weapons releases, kill chains completed against ground targets in the New Mexico desert. The OA-X experiment, later rebranded the Light Attack Experiment, or LAE, had been designed to answer a question the Air Force kept asking itself but never seemed willing to resolve: whether cheap, simple aircraft could handle the low-end fight so that expensive, complex aircraft could be preserved for the high-end one. The answer, documented across hundreds of pages, was yes. The Air Force chose not to act on it. That report never received the kind of institutional promotion that accompanies a successful acquisition milestone. There was no press conference and no program of record announcement. The following fiscal year's budget contained no line item for it. Air Force Chief of Staff General David Goldfein had publicly championed the experiment. In a 2017 press briefing, he called it a look at what's possible and said the service needed to be willing to take risk. The momentum had stalled by 2019. A year later, the Light Attack program was functionally dead as an Air Force procurement initiative, reduced to a handful of aircraft earmarked for partner nation training rather than American combat squadrons. The institutional resistance was not subtle. Senior leaders within Air Combat Command and the fighter pilot community viewed the turboprop light attack concept as a threat, not to the enemy, but to force structure. $1 spent on a $10 million turboprop was $1 not spent on an F-35 at $89 million per unit. Meanwhile, each squadron of light attack aircraft was a squadron that didn't need a 4th-generation or 5th-generation pilot in the seat. The arithmetic was existential for an Air Force that had been shrinking its fighter fleet for 30 years while simultaneously arguing it needed more fighters, not fewer. A 2020 Government Accountability Office report noted that the Air Force had spent approximately $6.4 billion annually on close air support sorties in Afghanistan and Iraq during peak operational years, flying F-15Es and F-16S that burned through engine life, airframe hours, and maintenance budgets at rates designed for high-intensity combat against peer adversaries. The same missions the LAE data showed could have been executed by AT-6 Wolverines, the armed variant of the T-6 Texan II, at a cost per flight hour of approximately $1,000 to $2,500 compared to $22,000 for the F-16 and $44,000 for the F-35A. Those figures came from Air Force budget justification documents submitted to Congress. They were the Pentagon's own numbers. The T-6 Texan II was never supposed to be a combat aircraft. Beechcraft, later Raytheon, later Textron Aviation Defense, had built it as a primary trainer, a replacement for the aging T-37 Tweet that had been teaching student pilots since 1957. Its lineage traced to the Swiss Pilatus PC-9, a single-engine turboprop designed for ab initio flight training in the Alps. The idea that this aircraft, or any derivative of it, could carry Hellfire missiles, GBU, 12 laser-guided bombs, and .50 caliber gun pods into a combat zone would have struck most Pentagon planners in the 1990s as absurd. The Texan II entered service in 2001 as the T-6A, a trainer and nothing more. 17 years later, its armed cousin put warheads on target at White Sands while costing less per sortie than the fuel bill alone for the jets it proposed to supplement. The buried report from Holloman didn't argue that turboprops should replace the F-35. It argued something far more dangerous to institutional thinking, that for the majority of combat sorties the United States had actually flown since September 2001, the F-35 was never needed in the first place. The sound hit you before the aircraft did. A T-37 tweet on short final produced a high-frequency shriek that could be heard 2 miles from the runway threshold. A piercing dental drill whine that earned it the nickname Tweety Bird among students and 6,000 screaming rivets among the maintenance crews who bled from their ears after a full day on the flight line. That noise was the sound of progress in 1957. The Air Force had decided, with the absolute conviction that characterized its early institutional identity, that the future of military aviation belonged exclusively to jet propulsion. Every aircraft in the training pipeline, from the first hour of student flight time to the last, would be jet-powered. Propellers were for cargo haulers, crop dusters, and the past. The reasoning had a certain Cold War logic. If a pilot's entire career would be spent in jet cockpits, interceptors, bombers, tactical fighters, then every hour spent behind a propeller was an hour of negative training. The aerodynamic behaviors were different. Torque effects, P-factor, the asymmetric thrust characteristics of a reciprocating engine. None of that translated to the centrifugal flow turbojets a student would fly in combat. The Air Training Command's 1954 study on pilot pipeline modernization concluded that propeller-driven primary trainers introduced habit patterns incompatible with high-performance jet aircraft. By 1961, the T-34 Mentor, a piston-engine Beechcraft that had served as the Air Force's primary trainer since the Korean War, was pulled from undergraduate pilot training entirely. The Navy held on to its T-34s longer, eventually upgrading to the turboprop T-34C Turbo Mentor in the mid-1970s, but even that was viewed within naval aviation circles as a concession to budget constraints rather than a philosophical commitment to propeller-driven training. The jet age had rendered an entire category of aircraft culturally extinct within the fighter community. This wasn't purely an American phenomenon. The Soviets followed a parallel track with the Aero L-29 Delphin, a Czech-built jet trainer that replaced piston types across Warsaw-Pact air forces starting in 1963. The British introduced the jet provost as a primary trainer in 1955, explicitly to eliminate the propeller stage. France went with the Fuga Magister. Across NATO and the Eastern Bloc alike, the institutional consensus was unanimous: jets from day one. The propeller had become, in the words of one Air Training Command briefing document from 1962, an anachronism unsuited to the modern combat pilot syllabus. That word, anachronism, would echo through 4 decades of procurement decisions. What got lost in the rush was a set of operational realities that didn't care about institutional preferences. Turboprop and piston aircraft could loiter. They could operate from unimproved strips and burned less fuel by orders of magnitude. Maintenance footprints were measured in man-hours per flight hour, not man-days. A T-28 Trojan, the piston engine trainer the Air Force had discarded, was quietly pulled out of retirement during the early years of Vietnam and sent to Laos, where it flew combat missions as a strike aircraft because jets couldn't slow down enough to find targets under triple canopy jungle. The Air Force didn't publicize this. The T-28s flew with Laotian and Thai markings under Project Water Pump and Operation Firefly, classified programs that acknowledged in practice what the service refused to admit in doctrine. Sometimes a slow, cheap, propeller-driven aircraft was the right tool. By the 1990s, the institutional allergy to propellers had calcified into something close to theology. Fighter pilots ran the Air Force, and fighter pilots flew jets. The cultural equation was simple, and it filtered down through every rank and every assignment board. When the Joint Primary Aircraft Training System competition opened in 1995 to replace the T-37, the winning design would need to reconcile an awkward fact: the most cost-effective, operationally proven primary training platform in the Western world was a Swiss turboprop with a propeller on its nose. Pilatus had been selling the PC-9 to air forces across 4 continents for a decade. Its training outcomes matched or exceeded those of jet-powered competitors at a fraction of the operating cost. The Air Force was about to buy a propeller aircraft again for the first time in 40 years. The service treated this less like a milestone and more like a secret. Beechcraft had no business winning the JPATS competition, at least not according to the conventional wisdom circulating through defense industry boardrooms in 1994. The company was a general aviation manufacturer based in Wichita, Kansas, known for King Airs and Bonanzas, corporate turboprops, and weekend flyers. Its military portfolio was thin. Cessna, Lockheed, Northrop Grumman, and Rockwell were all fielding entries with jet-powered designs or established military pedigrees. The assumption inside the Pentagon's acquisition community was that a jet would win, because a jet had to win. The Air Force had spent 4 decades building an all-jet training culture, and reversing that trajectory would require someone at the general officer level to admit the original decision had been wrong. Beechcraft's bet was that the numbers would be too loud to ignore. The company had secured a licensing agreement with Pilatus Aircraft of Stans, Switzerland, to produce a derivative of the PC-9 for the American competition. The PC-9 was already flying with the air forces of Australia, Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, and several other nations. It was a tandem-seat, low-wing monoplane powered by a single Pratt & Whitney Canada PT-6A-62 turboprop producing 950 shaft horsepower, enough to push the airframe to 270 knots in level flight and sustain aerobatic maneuvering at +7/-3.5 G. The aircraft had a pressurized cockpit, Martin Baker ejection seats, and a fatigue life calculated at 18,000 hours. Operating costs ran to roughly $600 per flight hour in 1990s dollars, compared to $1,200 for the T-37 and substantially more for any jet-powered alternative in the competition. Beechcraft's proposal, designated the Mark II, was not a simple rebadge of the Swiss design. Beechcraft stretched the fuselage, modified the wing geometry, and redesigned the cockpit with a digital glass instrument panel. Approximately 70% of the airframe components were changed from the original PC-9. Pilatus would later dispute the degree of modification, a disagreement that festered into a legal battle lasting years. But for the purposes of JPATS, the Mark II was legally and contractually an American product, assembled in Wichita by American workers. The distinction was not trivial. Congressional procurement rules required domestic manufacturing, and Beechcraft had structured the entire partnership to satisfy those requirements from the outset. The competition ran from 1992 to 1995, with 7 entries submitted for evaluation. The Cessna entry was the citation-based Jayhawk proposal. Rockwell offered a version of the Ranger 2000, a joint venture with Deutsche Aerospace. Northrop Grumman submitted the Pampa 2000, derived from an Argentine jet trainer. All 3 were jet-powered, and all 3 carried the implicit argument that the Air Force should stay the course with jet primary training. The evaluation criteria, however, had been structured around life cycle cost as a weighted factor, not just unit price, but total cost of ownership across 20 years of operations, including fuel, maintenance, spare parts, engine overhauls, and infrastructure. This is where the turboprop advantage became mathematically insurmountable. The Pratt & Whitney PT-6 engine family had accumulated over 300 million flight hours across military and civilian applications by the mid-1990s. Its time between overhauls was measured in thousands of hours. The supply chain was global and mature. A PT-6 could be pulled, overhauled, and returned to service in a fraction of the time and cost required for a small military turbojet. When the Air Force ran the life cycle cost models, the Beechcraft entry came in at roughly $3.8 billion for a fleet of 711 aircraft over 20 years. The nearest jet competitor was significantly higher. On June 22, 1995, the Department of Defense announced that Beechcraft had won JPATS. The aircraft would be designated the T-6A Texan II, a name deliberately chosen to invoke the legendary North American T-6 Texan that had trained Allied pilots during World War II. The irony was hard to miss. The original T-6 was a propeller aircraft too, part of the very generation of trainers the Air Force had discarded in its rush toward jets. The reaction inside the service was mixed in ways that didn't show up in the official press releases. Instructor pilots at the 12th Flying Training Wing at Randolph Air Force Base, Texas, the unit that would eventually stand up the T-6A program, expressed skepticism about transitioning from a jet to a turboprop. Performance wasn't the issue. The T-6A could replicate every maneuver in the primary training syllabus and several that the T-37 could not safely perform. The real objection was cultural. A young second lieutenant arriving at pilot training would now spend the first phase of the program behind a propeller, and some within the instructor cadre worried this sent the wrong signal about what kind of service the Air Force was. The contract was signed anyway. Beechcraft would deliver 454 aircraft to the Air Force and 328 to the Navy, replacing both the T-37 and the Navy's T-34C in a unified joint training platform. Total contract value at signing, $4.3 billion. First deliveries began in 2000, with initial operating capability declared in 2001. For the first time in decades, a propeller-driven aircraft was the primary trainer for both services. Nobody at Beechcraft was yet thinking about what happened if you hung weapons on it. A single GBU-12 Pavwe, 2 laser-guided bomb weighs 490 pounds and costs approximately $21,000. The pickup truck it was dropped on in Helmand Province in 2014 was worth maybe $4,000 on the Kandahar used vehicle market. The F-15E Strike Eagle that delivered it had launched from Bagram Airfield, burned through 40 minutes of combat fuel to reach the target area, loitered for another 90 minutes, waiting for a joint terminal attack controller to clear the strike, release the weapon, and return to base. Total cost of that single sortie, fuel, maintenance, munitions, aircrew flight pay, prorated engine wear, exceeded $80,000. For one truck. Multiply that by 20,000 close air support sorties per year at the height of Operation Enduring Freedom, and the arithmetic becomes physically painful to read. By 2015, the Air Force was flying its most advanced tactical aircraft against an enemy that possessed no air force, no integrated air defense system, no radar network, and no electronic warfare capability. The Taliban operated in sandals. The response was a twin-engine, twin-seat strike fighter designed to penetrate Soviet-era air defenses at Mach 2.5, carrying a AN/APG-82 active electronically scanned array radar capable of tracking multiple airborne targets simultaneously. None of those capabilities mattered over Nangarhar province. What mattered was time on station, sensor resolution, the ability to put a single precision munition through the window of a compound, and the cost of keeping the aircraft overhead while doing it. The F-15E could do that. So could an aircraft costing 1/8 as much to operate. Lieutenant General James Mike Holmes, then Deputy Chief of Staff for Strategic Plans, Programs, and Requirements, told the Senate Armed Services Committee in 2016 that the Air Force was burning out our fourth-generation fleet on missions that did not require fourth-generation performance. His testimony was blunt. The service was consuming airframe life at unsustainable rates, and the missions driving that consumption were overwhelmingly low-threat close air support and armed overwatch in permissive environments. The F-16 fleet told the story in metal fatigue. Block 40 and Block 50, Voight's F-16S, had been designed with a structural life of 8,000 flight hours. Extended operations in Afghanistan and Iraq had pushed many airframes past 7,000 hours by the mid-2010s, triggering costly service life extension programs that ran $25 million or more per aircraft, nearly the original procurement cost of the jet. Each hour over Afghan terrain was an hour unavailable for training against peer adversaries and an hour closer to mandatory retirement. it was also an hour that degraded the Air Force's ability to fight the war it actually feared. The operational tempo was cannibalizing readiness for a high-end conflict in order to sustain a low-end one. The cost disparity was not a secret. It was rarely discussed, though, in the public forums where budget priorities were set. A 2015 RAND Corporation study on close air support alternatives noted that turboprop platforms could deliver equivalent effects in permissive environments at operational costs between 10 and 40 times lower than tactical jet fighters. The study's authors were careful to note that turboprops could not survive in contested airspace. Nobody was arguing they should. The argument was simpler and harder to refute. When the threat environment doesn't require a $50 million jet, sending one anyway is just waste. General Mike Holmes picked up the phone in the spring of 2017 and set the experiment in motion. Now a 4-star commanding Air Combat Command, Holmes had moved from testifying about the problem to owning the solution. The program was designated OA-X, the O for observation, the A for attack, the X for experimental. Holloman Air Force Base in southern New Mexico would host the evaluations, with White Sands Missile Range providing the weapons ranges. The premise was deliberately stripped of ambiguity. Take commercially available, off-the-shelf light attack aircraft, arm them with precision munitions already in the inventory. Fly realistic combat profiles against simulated counterinsurgency targets and measure what happened. No developmental prototypes, no PowerPoint promises. Flying hardware and live weapons generating real data. 2 aircraft emerged as the primary contenders. The Textron AT-6 Wolverine was a weaponized derivative of the T-6 Texan II, the same training aircraft already sitting on ramp space at a dozen Air Force bases. Textron had added wing hardpoints rated for 4,000 pounds of external stores, integrated a belly-mounted electro-optical and infrared sensor turret, installed a laser designator, and wired the aircraft to deliver GBU 12 Paveway 2 laser-guided bombs, AGM-114 Hellfire missiles, 2.75-inch guided rockets, and a .50 caliber gun pod. The airframe retained its Pratt & Whitney PT6A-68D engine, now flat-rated, at 1,600 shaft horsepower. The second contender was the Embraer/Sierra Nevada Corporation, a 29 Super Tucano, a purpose-built light attack turboprop that had already seen combat in Colombia, Brazil, Afghanistan, with the Afghan Air Force, and several African nations. It carried a similar weapons suite but had been designed from the ground up as a combat platform rather than adapted from a trainer. Phase 1 ran from August through September 2017. Over 4 weeks, the 2 aircraft flew more than 120 combined sorties in the skies over southern New Mexico. The profiles were not gentle introductions. Joint Terminal Attack Controllers on the ground called in close air support requests using standard 9-line briefs, the same format used in Afghanistan and Iraq. Targets included vehicle convoys, simulated compounds, personnel in the open, and time-sensitive objectives requiring rapid sensor-to-shooter cycles. Weapons release altitudes varied from medium altitude to low-level attack profiles. The aircraft operated in daytime, at night using forward-looking infrared, and in mixed conditions with dust and reduced visibility. 72 hours into the evaluation, the maintenance data was already diverging sharply from what the legacy fleet produced. The AT-6 Wolverine was generating roughly 2 maintenance man-hours per flight hour. For comparison, the F-35A Lightning II averaged approximately 50 maintenance man-hours per flight hour during the same period, according to the Department of Defense's selected acquisition reports for fiscal year 2017. The AT-6 could be turned, rearmed, and launched again in under 45 minutes with a ground crew of 4. An F-16 sortie turnaround at a deployed location required a crew of 20 or more and several hours of post-flight inspection. The operational cost per flight hour for the AT-6 came in under $2,500. The A-29 was comparable. An F-16 cost between $22,000 and $27,000 per flight hour, depending on the block variant and operational context. Weapons accuracy was not a problem. Both aircraft delivered GBU-12S within the same circular error probable as fourth-generation fighters. The guided rockets, particularly the Advanced Precision Kill Weapon System, a laser-guided 2.75-inch rocket, proved devastatingly effective against soft targets at a cost of roughly $22,000 per round, compared to the $115,000 price tag of a Hellfire. The sensor turrets provided full-motion video feeds directly to ground forces, enabling the kind of persistent armed overwatch that infantry commanders in Afghanistan had been begging for since 2005. General Holmes, in remarks to reporters at the Air Force Association's annual conference in September 2017, described the experiment's early results as demonstrating that light attack could provide 80% of the capability at 20% of the cost. The data package that came out of Holloman was dense. Hundreds of pages of sortie reports, weapons delivery scores, maintenance logs, fuel consumption records, sensor performance evaluations. None of it was ambiguous. The Air Force had spent $1.7 trillion developing the F-35 program. The AT-6. Wolverine cost approximately $20 million per copy. Both could kill a pickup truck. One of them could do it all afternoon without going home to refuel. Phase 2 was already being scheduled before Phase 1's final sortie landed. We don't have a light attack problem. We have a fighter pilot problem. The line circulated informally among Air Force acquisition officers in 2018. Never attributed on the record, never repeated in testimony. It captured something the Holloman data couldn't quantify. Phase 2 of the OA-X experiment ran from May through July 2018 at Holloman and White Sands, expanding the evaluation to include combat search and rescue escort profiles, forward air controller missions, and integration with special operations ground teams. The results reinforced everything Phase 1 had demonstrated. Weapons accuracy remained consistent, maintenance footprints stayed small, and cost-per-effect ratios held at fractions of what the tactical jet fleet required. The Air Force had now accumulated nearly a year of live fire, operationally representative data proving that a turboprop could perform the majority of missions being flown in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and across the African continent at a cost reduction that bordered on embarrassing. Then the program stalled, not with a dramatic cancellation announcement or a congressional funding cut. Those would have at least created a paper trail, a decision point someone could be held accountable for. The light attack experiment simply lost momentum, bled out through a series of deferred decisions, restructured timelines, and shifting priorities that collectively amounted to institutional suffocation. None of the reasons had anything to do with the aircraft's performance. The Air Force promotion system rewards officers who manage large, complex, expensive programs. A $20 million turboprop buys no one a star. The acquisition workforce, program managers, contracting officers, test engineers, builds careers on developmental programs with long timescales, substantial budgets, and high technical risk. Light attack was commercially available, technically mature, and cheap. It offered almost nothing for the bureaucracy to manage. A retired Air Force colonel who had served in Air Combat Command's Requirements Directorate told the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies in a 2019 forum that the light attack concept threatened the business model of how the service acquires aircraft. He was being polite. What he meant was that the people who decide what the Air Force buys have no professional incentive to buy something simple. Fighter pilot culture compounded the structural problem. The Air Force is led overwhelmingly by officers who flew fast jets. Of the 22 Air Force Chiefs of Staff who served between 1947 and 2020, the vast majority came from fighter or bomber backgrounds. The service's identity is built around high-performance aviation, Mach 2 interceptors, stealth penetration, beyond visual range combat. A turboprop attack aircraft, no matter how effective, doesn't look the part. It looks like something from a different era and a lesser Air Force. The Brazilian Air Force flies the A-29 Super Tucano in combat and considers it indispensable. The Colombian Air Force used it to dismantle FARC jungle camps with precision strikes over a decade of sustained operations. The Afghan Air Force, before the collapse of 2021, flew combat sorties in it daily. These were not hypothetical employment concepts. They were ongoing wars producing real body counts with real aircraft. The United States Air Force looked at all of this, looked at its own test data confirming identical conclusions, and bought exactly 0 light attack aircraft for its own operational squadrons. In February 2019, the Air Force announced it would purchase a small number of A-29 Super Tucanos, but only for the purpose of training partner nations, not for American combat use. The aircraft would go to the 81st Fighter Squadron at Moody Air Force Base, Georgia, a unit dedicated to advising foreign air forces. The AT-6 Wolverine received no production order at all. Textron had invested years of company funding into the modification, integration, and demonstration of a combat-capable variant of an aircraft the Air Force already owned 450 copies of. The reward for proving the concept worked was a polite thank you and a closed door. By 2020, the light attack experiment had been quietly folded into a broader Armed Overwatch program managed by Special Operations Command, removing it entirely from the conventional Air Force's budget lines and organizational responsibility. The data from Holloman went into filing cabinets. The F-35 program received its next tranche of funding on schedule. Tucano Air Base sits in the Magdalena River Valley of central Colombia, where the humidity never drops below 80% and the tarmac shimmers with heat distortion by 0900 hours. In July 2012, a pair of Colombian Air Force A-29 Super Tucanos launched from that tarmac, carrying 4 GBU, 12 Pavwe, 2 laser-guided bombs between them. Their target was a FARC command camp buried in triple canopy jungle 140 kilometers to the south, identified through weeks of intelligence fusion between Colombian military intelligence and embedded American advisors. The 2 aircraft arrived over the target area at 0640 hours, acquired the camp through their infrared sensor turrets while the jungle below was still dark, designated the structures with onboard laser systems, and released. The bombs struck within seconds of each other. Colombian ground forces who reached the site later that morning confirmed the destruction of the camp and the death of a senior FARC commander. Total munitions cost for the strike was under $50,000. The Colombian Air Force had been conducting operations like this since 2003, accumulating more than 30,000 combat flight hours on the A-29 across a decade of sustained counterinsurgency warfare. Their aircraft had a mission-capable rate above 90%, a number the F-35 program would not achieve in its first decade of service. Nigeria purchased 12 A-29 Super Tucanos through a foreign military sales agreement finalized in 2018, with deliveries completed by 2021. The aircraft entered combat almost immediately against Boko Haram and Islamic State West Africa Province fighters operating in the northeast. Nigerian Air Force pilots, many of them trained at Moody Air Force Base by the 81st Fighter Squadron, flew armed reconnaissance and close air support missions over Borno State using the same weapons suite evaluated at Holloman. The operational context was austere: limited maintenance infrastructure, extreme heat, abrasive sand ingestion on every sortie. The A-29s kept flying. Their maintenance requirements were low enough that Nigerian ground crews with relatively modest training could sustain operational tempos that would have been impossible with fast jets. Lebanon, the Philippines, Indonesia, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, the list of nations operating armed turboprops in combat or near-combat conditions continued expanding through the late 2010s. The conclusion was the same in every case, arrived at under wildly different conditions. Afghanistan provided the most painful data point. The Afghan Air Force received 26 O-29 Super Tucanos beginning in 2016, and Afghan pilots flew them in daily combat operations against the Taliban across multiple provinces. A Government Accountability Office report published in June 2021 noted that the A-29 had become the Afghan Air Force's most effective strike platform, delivering precision munitions with a reliability that the service's aging fleet of Mi-35 helicopters could not match. 2 months after that report was published, the Afghan government collapsed. Taliban fighters captured intact A-29s on the ramp at Hamid Karzai International Airport and Mazar-e-Sharif. Aircraft that had been dropping bombs on Taliban positions in May were sitting under Taliban control by September. The airframes were rendered inoperable through a combination of removed components and disabled avionics before American forces departed, according to U.S. Central Command statements. Whether all of them were fully demilitarized remains an open question. Some things stay buried in the chaos of an evacuation conducted under fire. 14 nations had put the turboprop to war. The one that built the experiment to prove it worked had not. 11,008. That is the number of T-6 Texan II airframes delivered to military operators worldwide as of early 2024 across 18 nations, making it the most produced Western military trainer of the post-Cold War era. Every single one of them is powered by a propeller. The AT-6 Wolverine sits in a peculiar category in American defense procurement, an aircraft that passed every test it was given and received nothing for it. The Holloman data was unambiguous, and so were the partner nation combat records. The cost per effect ratios were so lopsided that presenting them next to F-35 figures in the same briefing slide required a footnote explaining that the comparison was not a typo. A $2,500 per hour aircraft delivering the same GBU, 12 to the same accuracy standard as a $42,000 per hour aircraft, is not a nuanced finding requiring further study. It is an answer. The Air Force spent 2 years and 2 evaluation phases arriving at that answer, then spent the next several years finding reasons not to act on it. Special Operations Command eventually selected the AT-802U Skywarden, another armed turboprop built by L3 Harris from an air tractor crop dusting airframe, for its armed overwatch program in 2022. The conventional Air Force, the service that designed and ran the OA-X experiment, bought nothing. The Wolverine prototype, serial number 07-3901, a converted T-6A that Textron had modified at company expense, continued flying demonstration sorties at air shows and industry events. The smell of exhaust from its PT-6A engine, that distinctive kerosene-sweet turboprop odor, sharper than jet fuel but softer than avgas, drifted across flight lines where F-35s sat in climate-controlled hangars, awaiting their next scheduled maintenance window. The Soviets understood something about this problem decades earlier, though they arrived at it from a different direction. The Sukhoi Su-25 Frogfoot was not a turboprop, but it embodied the same philosophy, a cheap, rugged, simple attack aircraft designed to absorb punishment and deliver ordnance in permissive airspace without bankrupting the logistics chain. The Soviets built over 1,000 of them. They flew in Afghanistan, Chechnya, Georgia, Syria, Ukraine. The airframe was not elegant. It was adequate, and adequacy multiplied across 1,000 copies is a force structure that a handful of exquisite platforms cannot replicate. The American approach to the same problem was to acknowledge the requirement, prove the solution, watch the data confirm the solution, and then decline to purchase it because the solution was insufficiently complex to justify the bureaucratic infrastructure needed to manage its acquisition. That is not a paraphrase. It is what happened. Textron's investment in the Wolverine program ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars over more than a decade of development, integration, flight testing, and demonstration. The company had bet that data would overcome institutional inertia. The bet was wrong, or at least premature. As of 2024, the AT-6 Wolverine remains in production-ready status, awaiting an order that the United States Air Force has shown no indication of placing. Foreign military sales inquiries continue. The airframe's certification for 7 distinct precision munition types, its 4,000-pound external stores capacity, its 1,800 nautical mile ferry range, its ability to operate from 3,000-foot unimproved strips, all of this remains on the spec sheet, validated by live fire, confirmed by operational testing, endorsed by partner nations, gathering dust. Meanwhile, at Randolph Air Force Base in Texas and Vance Air Force Base in Oklahoma, Before Vance's scheduled closure, student pilots in standard T-6A Texan IIs continued flying training sorties every day the weather allowed. The same Pratt & Whitney PT-6A engine, the same Hartzell four-blade composite propeller pulling the aircraft through Texas thermals at 320 knots. That airframe, the one Holloman proved, could carry a GBU-12 and put it through a window. That report from the summer of 2018, the one that circulated through Air Force acquisition offices at the Pentagon, concluded that a turboprop could perform the majority of combat sorties flown since September 2001 at a fraction of the cost of the tactical jet fleet. The Air Force's response was to file it. The propeller, declared dead in 1961, when the last T-28 Trojan left the training syllabus, is still spinning at 2,000 revolutions per minute on flight lines across 4 continents, delivering bombs for 14 air forces. 15. If the United States ever reads its own paperwork.